This is what happens when you're special. You vanish. Sometimes for days, but often for months, and once for almost a year. That was the first time I disappeared. In the isolation hospital where we lay in our own glass cells, I'd listen to the wireless, tagging after Helen Shapiro as she walked back to happiness, or racing along wide sunlit highways with Paul Evans, somewhere in the technicolor impossibility of America. Keep your mind on the driving, keep your hands on the wheel, and keep your snoopy eyes on the road ahead. We're having fun, sitting in the back seat, kissing and hugging with Fred. In the evenings, after the visitors left, the others arrived. I don't believe in ghosts, but I've seen them. For most of the time I was by myself, and so I began talking to the dead. I wasn't surprised. These things happen when you're small. When I was older, I told my nan about it, and she said her mother had the gift of second sight, and that gift must have been passed down to me. It wasn't as exciting as it sounds. The dead were pretty average on the entertainment front. A step up from Dixon of Dock Green, but not as good as Zed Cars. For a lot of the time, we discussed who was best, Barbie or Cindy. I thought Barbie, and the dead agreed. We'd speculate about what the Lone Ranger and Tonto might be doing out in the wild, wild west. I'd teach the dead the latest hits, and we'd sing Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious and We're All Going on a Summer Holiday. When I was well enough, I'd show them how to do the twist. We'll shake it up, baby. Twist and shout, twist and shout. Come on, come on, come on, come on, baby now. Come on, baby. Come on and work it on out. Work it on out. Later, London County Council decided I was so special that I should be sent to a special school for special children. When I grew up, I learned that special was just another word for second best, and anything that had special in its name was almost certainly shite. But as children, we only have our own immediate experience. The people who worked in special education were the eccentrics and misfits, too incompetent, unconventional, or downright dangerous to be let loose in the mainstream, but perfectly acceptable in segregated institutions. After all, just as there were few expectations of special children, there were even fewer expectations of the people who taught them. In winter 1963, it felt like the world would freeze with John F. Kennedy and the Beatles. We played a game called Who Will Be the Last to Put Their Coat On? The headmaster, Wing Commander Teddy Barnes, had firm ideas about the benefits of fresh air. Naturally, his singular theories only applied to other people. As pack ice barricaded the Thames from Oxford to Kingston and the sea froze off Southend, we'd huddle in the unheated wooden chalets which passed for classrooms. The snow began falling on Boxing Day and transformed London into Archangel until March. Whenever the school bus could make its way through the blizzards, the day would stretch out in an endless stream of cold and misery. Glad that I live am I, that the sky is blue, glad for the country lanes and the fall of dew, after the sun the rain, after the rain the sun, This is the way of life till the work be done. All that we need to do, be we low or high, is to see that we grow nearer the sky. It all seemed like jolly good fun. What wasn't there to like? There were trips to the circus. There was the annual taxi drivers outing to the seaside when we ran berserk in Brighton, overdosing on E-numbers whilst the cabbies holed up in the nearest pub. There was country dancing. There were carol concerts. There were the school plays. And being small and fair, I was an angel, a fairy, a princess, Tiny Tim. And when I was too old to be Tiny Tim, I was Tiny Tim's brother. I hated it all. I hated the unthinking cruelty of the circus. I hated the school song and the boy with the burned face who followed me in dreams. I hated it when classmates disappeared without any explanation, and I was too frightened to ask where they'd gone. Most of all, I hated the nagging realization that I was drifting further and further into nothingness. The dead told me I might never come back. So I taught myself to read, and I vanished again, this time into books.
When I was at school, I spent intervals and lunch breaks searching through encyclopedias, trying to find out why I was different. I never grew out of trying to answer that question, in part because I wasn't allowed to. I was partially diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when I was 17, but I didn't find that out until I was 29. What I really wanted, then, now, for all of the time in between, was to blast off from this silly, stupid rock, full of people and faces I didn't and still don't understand. Imagine that each experience of your life is represented as a paperclip, and that these paperclips, the memories of your life, are linked together in one long chain. One experience leads into the next, as yesterday does into today, does into tomorrow. Scrunch up the paperclips, and they begin to connect and interlock in ways they're not supposed to, that they're never meant to. And now, if you're me, you can't untangle them. You can't make sense of the original sequence. You experience all too many other unintended thoughts and emotions, whether you want to or not. I experience all too many other unintended thoughts and emotions, whether I want to or not. My entire consciousness engaged in a rambling, rampaging barroom brawl inside my skull. Every thought I've ever had, every feeling I've ever felt, flowing through my head all at once, and it's too much. This is my Asperger's at its worst. The gravity of my past, pulling me down. The weight of intersecting time and memory, preventing escape from a black hole I don't know I'll ever get out of. I don't know whether adult diagnosis is worse. Oh wait, it is, because those very words, adult diagnosis, underline the fact I should have known earlier. Bureaucratically, it took 12 years and another 6 months to get my confirmed diagnosis. Medically, it took about an hour and a half. The doctor asked me a series of questions and graded my answers on a scale of 1 to 5 and judged me past the threshold. Great. Now I'm past the threshold. What about when I was 17, when a disengaged psychologist spoke over me for an hour at a time for 6 weeks and then wrote a report, which I never got to see, saying, many of Stuart's features are of a particular personality type. This is the Asperger/schizoid personality type. I've been this way since I was born. Not since the MMR, and if you believe differently, there's the door. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye. Go read a book for once instead of a conspiracy website. After my diagnosis, I went into a kind of dazed shock, the sort that can last for 5 minutes or several years. In my shock, I travelled back in time, crisscrossing the chain of my past. School, failed relationships and abandoned friendships, the years I spent alone in my own company, shut off from the world. The sheer abundance of the loss of the possibilities of a life I could have lived instead had I been told about my Asperger's from the start.
We've become used to gaps, to vanishings. So inured to absence, we barely notice when it happens. I seldom think about the ones who've gone, not dead, not living, just no longer here.
When the street where I was born imploded, at least there was some closure. Occasionally, I've gone back. I've shown my children. I've said, look, that's where there used to be a garden, a row of shops, the Torah Talmud school, the flower market. People move in and out of place, of time. My granddad stands intentionally casual
Against the back wall of the Lores off Half Moon Street.
He's trying out what he considers to be a stylish pose. It's less than 6 months since he wiped the stinking shit of Drummure from his boots. Not that you'd know. The clothes, the attitude. Bill is a living inventory of self-advancement and ambition. He's on the make and on the up. He embraces, kisses London, and it draws him into Covent Garden. It's where so many of the Scots and Irish castaways eventually wash up, gravitating towards the theatres, Oddham's Press, coffee houses, bagnios, early morning pubs, costermongers selling silkworms and stewed eels, the flower market. 600 miles from the Elgin hinterland, but it might as well be 6 million. In the 1911 census, he gives his occupation as theatrical scene shifter, and he shifts in and out of our family history. A cheat, a chancer, a wide boy, a grifter, always with his eye on the next deal and fast getaway. He teams up with the Romany horse trader Benny Lavender, and together they scam and charm their way across the south of England. It's all going so well until he leaves for a few days and doesn't bother to come back. All I want is a room somewhere far away from the cold night air with one enormous chair. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? Nan worked at Covent Garden. It wasn't like My Fair Lady. Professor Higgins and Colonel Pickering didn't whisk her away in a hansom to Wimpole Street, run through a few quick choruses of "The rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain," and shout, "By Jove, she's got it!" Fate didn't step in to lend a hand. Nan's family live in White Horse Yard, next to St Paul's Cathedral, a 5-minute trot from Covent Garden. This is what she doesn't yet know. Her first husband, Walter, will die young. Her second, Bill, the Maury conman, the tutor with the gift of the gab, will desert her and their 5 children. She'll live through Zeppelin raids, a general strike, the Depression, the Blitz, the founding of the welfare state. By the time she dies, she'll be the last one standing, the only woman porter left at Covent Garden. In the end, they'll make a film about her. The women porters were once the mainstay of the market. The Scots and Irish basket women, tough, combative, boozy. They formed an impressive enclave of the Celtic diaspora, speaking Erse, a mix of Gaelic and Gallic, and carrying huge loads on their backs and heads. One bet she could carry a large man all the way from Covent Garden to the Elephant and Castle in under 25 minutes. By Blackfriars Bridge, she downed a generous glug of gin, and when her passenger got restless, shut him up by threatening to throw him into a ditch. She arrived at the Elephant with time to spare, to be greeted by a cheering crowd, showering her with presents. Nan kept up the traditions. She was a pint-sized tyrant, dressed in black, terrorising everyone around her. She and her cat Minnie, an enormous ginger Tom, which hid in the living room sideboard, were both infamous scrappers, never happier than when they were feuding with the neighbours. Everything was a bleeding liberty or a fucking carry-on, as far as she was concerned. When she died, the family gave a collective sigh of relief, particularly my Uncle Charlie, her youngest son. With the face of a bruiser and a body to match, he'd been too scared to tell Nan he'd got married and kept up the pretense he was working nights for almost 2 years. It was a surprise, to say the least, when his secret wife turned up at the funeral. So, Nan was another one who came and went. The dead are notoriously unreliable, and for a long time I didn't see her. Then, suddenly, like Minnie launching himself from the sideboard, she reappeared. I was reading a book by Peter Ackroyd, and it hit me. The woman he was talking about had to be Nan. It was a family legend that she'd been in a film, and here it was, Lindsay Anderson's classic documentary about Covent Garden and its people. From there, it was easy to track down every day except Christmas and watch clips on YouTube. Earlier this year, she rocked up again, 31 minutes into London, the Modern Babylon, Julian Temple's time-travelling epic. She disappears, then when I'm least expecting her, she's back.
I went to mainstream schools starting in 1979. My experience going to mainstream schools was so vastly different than going to special schools. Mainstream schools seem to have definite goals and aims to achieve and go for in going to college and university, whereas special schools seem to teach for almost the sake of it. And I suppose sending me to mainstream schools was a very brave thing for my parents to choose for me to do, given that in 1979 there was very little integration, if any, of disabled people into the mainstream school system, let alone any councils doing any integration of disabled people at all. Warwickshire Council were one of the few areas at that time in Scotland who were integrating disabled kids into mainstream schools. So we as a family moved to Larg in 1979 for that reason. At the age of 9, I went to the Robert Owen Primary School with its bright shirts and purple ties, was one of the most colourful uniforms I ever wore in my entire time at school until I was 16 years old. Going to mainstream schools was daunting, but I can only say that as an adult. Looking back, not as a 9-year-old at the time. In 1979 and 1980, there was very little contact between able-bodied kids and disabled kids. So having me in the classroom must have seemed like an alien being there, something not many of them would have encountered or even dealt with. So it was daunting for both me and them, to say the least.
I was so special. I was sent to special school for special children.
And yet,
Anti-bullying,
blank,
child protection,
blank,
disability.
blank.
That was the first time I disappeared.
That's what happens when you're special. You vanish.
And yet,
I always wanted to be a superhero because I wanted to be special.
and yet,
Not dead, not living, just no longer here.
I experience all too many other unintended thoughts and emotions.
And yet,
Teaching at the Robert Owen made me words and numbers in preparation for big school. I mean, I did have interaction with able-bodied kids in the playground. Very unfortunately, I broke a boy's leg with my electric wheelchair. The boy's name is Adrian Bones, which gave me a fright. My mother compared it as a fright, and Peter caused him to have his leg broken, I'm sure. At the age of 12, I must admit, I was a bit of a terror in my wheelchair. I used to leave the Robert Owen, which was on a hill, and go down the pavement in full pelt, going from one pavement to the other pavement, and missing the road out in between. It was a real Dukes of Hazzard driving. I even had the school bully lie down in the middle of the pavement and challenged me to run him over. So I went for him, and he moved while whining, and I never got moved after that. I think I scared him to death. Mind you, I scared most of other people to death as well. But I've since calmed down my driving, which comes with age and wisdom. Although the wise part is a bit more questionable, I think. So at age 12 I went to Warwick Grammar Secondary School, which was made up of 3 buildings. The main building being built in 1816. And having an air raid siren as a fire alarm. There were no lifts in any of the 3 buildings, so it was stairs only. And sometimes to me it felt like 1,000 staircases instead of maybe 10 or so. So I could walk and I could climb back then, which was just as well. So I maybe did this on my own, looking after myself, carrying 2 sticks in a bag, going up and down school. How I never fell, I have no idea. By luck, more than anything else, my guess. I mean, I did get help from fellow pupils, which was alright, and okay, but on another occasion, a girl told me that I was disabled because God wanted me to be. So thanks very much for that. It's very useful and helpful information to know. I mean, just as I'm starting out life, I'm very uplifting as well.
I was so special. I was sent to a special school for special children.
And yet,
anti-bullying,
blank,
child protection,
blank,
disability.
blank.
That was the first time I disappeared.
That's what happens when you're special.
And yet,
I always wanted to be a superhero because I always wanted to be special.
and yet,
Not dead, not living, just no longer here.
I experience all too many unintended other thoughts and emotions.
And yet,
I did hang out with other kids, but it was mainly at breaks and lunchtimes. But they were just people to hang out with. I never had any real friends at school. Nobody to hang out with at nights or weekends, so I spent a lot of time on my own, which is not a nice or good feeling to have, especially if you're in your teenage years, when you want to be able to in-crowd, which I never was. Instead, I was special. We had a teacher in our school called Killer Care, one of the most feared teachers in the whole of the school. He was rumoured to have been a mercenary. He was a lad teacher who had a huge grey whipping belt hanging on the wall behind him as he taught. He let me away with being late. If I had been able-bodied, I would have had a pea-inducing bollocking. But then again, I was special. I mean, going to mainstream schools was a good experience, although it was a very isolating one for me personally, if I'm being completely honest. All the same, it made me who I am. It gave me a sense of independence, which I still have, which I think makes the experience worthwhile. It made me see myself not as disabled, although of course my disability is a part of me, of course it is, but it's not the whole of me as a person, it's part of me as a human being. The fact that today people and governments are still arguing about how much integration there should be of disabled people into the mainstream 38 years later says about how far society has to go, and as people as well. Although we have come a long way since 79, we will never have a society where everybody is equal. But that shouldn't stop us trying and fighting for more acceptance and a better understanding of why society disables us and has not enabled people of my generation. If you're young and disabled now, there seems to be a greater acceptance and expectation, which should mean a brighter future, even if we have to work at it all the time, for the rest of time, if you see what I mean.
Hans Asperger's observations of the so-called autistic psychopaths gave my condition its name. Psychopath. I like that word. It would have provided an explanation as to why I am the way I am, and I did wonder way back when. But the truth is, I'm just a teeny tiny little bit too sane to be crazy, and maybe just a little bit too crazy to be sane. So instead, I struggle on. The earliest histories of autism, of the social exclusion of unusual children, from the feral wild boy of Burundi to Asperger's little professors who recounted their observations and specialist knowledge by rote. I was both a wild boy and a little professor, and still am, albeit with wider trousers and a shorter vocabulary. My obsession was Doctor Who, which was especially odd because it wasn't on television at the time. I think the reason I looked up to the Doctor, and by the way, if people can refer to Kim or the Donald as if they're real people and not fictional, then, so can I. The reason I looked up to the Doctor was she made it okay to be different. I suppose looking up to a madman with two hearts made some kind of sense. It would have helped for me to have had the extra one, to help carry the burden of all that extra feeling. I wasn't popular when I was younger. Those of us on the autistic spectrum have very strong reactions to our own and other people's emotions, but we don't understand them. Psychopaths and 7-year-olds, on the other hand, they understand completely. I was bullied a lot, and I'm not going to go into that here, but I do remember always being told, Stuart, it's not your fault. But then when I got my diagnosis, I wondered, is that why some of those things happened? When I was at school, if you weren't getting the shit kicked out of you, it wasn't considered bullying. It didn't matter. The authorities remain woefully ignorant of the fact that it's the emotional stuff that stays with you. On my old secondary school's website, there are lots of saccharine stories about how well the pupils are doing, the prizes they've won, the plaudits they've achieved. This is it should be. I remember being in a few of those myself. But then I took a look at their anti-bullying policy, their child protection policy, their disability policy. Anti-bullying, blank. Child protection, blank. Disability, blank. The pages were there. The space had been set aside, but the content was absent. They hadn't even bothered to paper over the cracks because it had just been forgotten about. It had been forgotten about because it wasn't important. If I'm really honest with myself, it had been forgotten about because I wasn't important. All of my pain meant nothing. There were some things that happened that the school couldn't have understood because I didn't understand them either. Once, when I was particularly young, we went on a school trip to a caravan park. I know, but this is the early 90s. And afterwards, we were asked to write thank you letters. I showed mine to the teacher, who told me I transposed the E and A in the word dear. I was so upset, I rubbed the letter out and started writing it down again. And I kept on going every time I made a mistake, rubbing out and writing down, until I could no longer see through my tears. When the teacher asked why, I couldn't remember. I didn't know. I didn't know why. I was just consumed by this feeling that I had done something wrong. That I was wrong. There are lots of photos of me from that time. My dad is a prolific home archivist. He's been doing it so long, his first home video camera was shoulder mounted. He does it because, yes, he's a little bit anal, but also because he wanted to look back now and remember his children as they were growing up then. But as I became older, those happy little snapshots seemed like hurtful trickery. A cruel reminder of a boy I could no longer place and no longer wanted inside myself. The home videos were worse. 24 little vicious stabbings per second. A frenzied violence from a past I could no longer face. The shadow of that boy had no purpose beyond taunting me with his presence. So I took some whiskey from the drinks cabinet, some matches from the kitchen. I dumped the photos in the back garden. It's not easy lighting fires in January, especially if you've never done it before. But I got it done. As an exclamation point, I threw my school blazer in the flames. I took everything I could find of the boy I once was and watched him burn. Even now, I still don't know that it was the wrong thing to do, but Dad, I am sorry.
The problem with being special is that bit by bit you lose contact with the ones who aren't. Whenever I realised that was happening, I'd remove myself even further and take off to Narnia or Kirin Island or the shores of the Silver Lake. Why bother with reality when fiction was so much better? I tried to stop talking to the dead when I began to consume words. Learning to read so late meant making up for all that lost time, and I read continuously, only coming up with breath if I had to. I read on the school bus as it made its way crawling through the London fog, looking out of the window when we got to South Island Place, where the rag and bone men stabled their ponies, and my inconvenient obsession began. I read countless books about ponies: Ghost Horse, Perfect Horse, Pony Jobs for Jill, Jill's Gymkhana, Rosettes for Jill. There were a lot of books about Jill. I dreamed of pony trekking in the Highlands, or even more thrillingly, in Ecuador. In the holidays, I'd take the city apart, looking for places where I'd keep the pony I knew I was going to own. Bits of wasteland, the abandoned house by the common, derelict garages. As I got older, I'd explore further, right out to the faraway frontiers of the Northern Line, checking out the possibilities for when I had my own riding school. This was dangerous territory where the others lived. At special school, the word disabled was never mentioned. Occasionally, handicapped was dropped into the conversation, but it was never about us. It was always about someone else, someone worse off. The spastic society collection boxes, the endless little blonde girls wearing calipers chained up outside sweet shops. Disabled people were sad because they weren't normal. Sometimes they were so bad they had to be taken away to the margins, the edgelands, that were once well out with London and still kept their friendly, country-sounding names. Coney Hatch, Springfield, Darrants Park, Warlingham Park, Longgrove, Royal Earlswood, Cane Hill. It was in one of those almost nowhere places where I met Martin, and he told me some of the things he knew, like each time you have an injection, you lose 2 brain cells. If you break the record player, you must pay for it out of your own money. It is a really bad idea to set fire to other people's coats. In the workshops, there is special paper, and it tastes of yellow. Lately, every time he looked in the mirror, he could see 2 really weak little eyes, and it made him cry.
We're almost wrapping up now, so I suppose I should try and slap on a happy ending. You've seen a small, perhaps unrepresentative, undeniably gorgeous example of Scotland's disabled population. And you leave here smiling because, hey, it's going to be okay. They're going to be all right. No chance. The only certainties are death, a government that's willing to send you there, and then, right after the end, some poor sod you only half knew and didn't even really like, standing over your grave mumbling, "He's in a better place," before going off towards some god-awful sandwiches that make you really glad you're not around to eat them. And yet, when I was younger, I loved reading comic books. I especially loved the ones where Superman and Batman would travel to parallel worlds. Earth 2, where the good guys are bad and the bad guys are good. Earth 3, where it's always the 1940s. I always wanted to be a superhero because I always wanted to be special. But I was a boy without superpowers. And then, one day, as I grew older, I began to wonder if maybe my superpower was that I could take other people's bad feelings away from them. I got that half right. I could take other people's feelings, but it didn't help them, it just hurt me. They would process them and move on from them in the usual way, but I could never lose them. And because I didn't understand them, I had no hope of losing them. I just kept hold of them, all the feeling, all of the time. And that's why it hurts so much. And yet, in a way, I was born in my own Earth 3, the wrong time in history, because if I'd been born even 10 years later, the odds are my Asperger's would have been diagnosed much sooner, because the way in which autistic spectrum conditions are dealt with and treated has changed. After my diagnosis, I spent some nights awake with the terrible possibility that, had I been diagnosed earlier, I might have been shunted off towards some educational backwater, to be given up on, to be forgotten. I know my parents wouldn't have let it happen, but that doesn't mean the educational authorities wouldn't have tried. I had what I had. And that's all right if things are different now. That's the deal I make with myself. And if I have to strap the rest of the world on my back and drag it along, I will do that too. I haven't given up on the secondary. I've made a pest of myself. I've called them repeatedly. Eventually I spoke to the deputy head, who crudely tweaked the anti-bullying page with some half-regurgitated blurb from the council website. So I kept on going. Eventually I spoke to the head. Plenty of promises, but I'm still waiting. That's fine, but I will keep on going because I need for things to be better for the children who are growing up now. I will keep on going until I can at least have them pretend that they care, and then have them do what they would do then. It's not all bad. I'm married on most days successfully, and for nearly 8 years now. Avantika is the only person I've ever met who completely accepts me for me, and she's the only person I can be the complete me around. I'd like to take this opportunity to plug her own one-woman fringe show, a 4-hour spectacular entitled Seriously, It's Not What You Think. He's not that bad to live with. After I got my diagnosis, a lot of people reacted in the same way. It's good that you know, but it doesn't change who you are. Seriously. But some people reacted different. My favourite was my friend Sammy. That's fantastic! Do you want some cake? What she was doing in her own confectionery constructed manner was not treating me as if I was special, but as if I was everyday, and that's the point. I won't ever get better. I take medication begrudgingly, very, very, very begrudgingly, because there's no pill or operation that can take me off of the autistic spectrum. Sasha won't ever get better. David won't ever get better. We are part of Scotland's disabled population, and we're not special. We're just everyday. And that is fabulous. If you choose to treat us that way.